Hey there, my name is Prakash. I'm the head of product of Xano, and I'm super excited because today I'm going to be doing a very requested video, which is part 2 of our WMX series. So WMX stands for Webflow, MemberStack, and Xano. We're going to be using Webflow on the front end for our website or our app, MemberStack to basically manage our membership and restrict access, and then finally we're going to be using Xano for all of the backend and the business logic. So we'll kind of show you how all of this works together. In part 1, we covered a lot of this stuff, so I highly recommend that you go back and watch part 1, which I'll link below. But let's go ahead and get started with what we're going to just add on to this. So first and foremost, if you haven't heard about Xano before, Xano is the fastest way to build your app's backend without using any code. We basically provide you a scalable server, a no-code API builder to build out your workflows, and a very flexible database to store everything in. So as I mentioned before, in part 1, we basically covered the setup of everything, including MemberStack and Xano, and we basically learned how to list items based on membership from Xano into Webflow managed by MemberStack. So that's what we did in part 1, and the video goes into great detail explaining how we do everything over there. So in part 2, we're going to take this a step further. I'll very quickly install the WMX template from scratch just so you can see how it's done. And then we're going to basically take that list view of items. We're going to make sure that it's clickable, like you can click one of the items, and you're going to go to a single item view. On that single item view, we're going to just see that one item. We're going to be able to favorite it, and we're going to be able to add a comment and also see the comments that are coming from Xano. So pretty cool stuff. Let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to start in Xano, and I'm going to just call this WMX part 2. I'll just make it capital, and I'll hit continue. And I want to start with this template over here, the WMX template, because this automatically installs API endpoints and database tables to get you started. So I'll go ahead and click that button, and it's going to basically install everything that I need for this foundation for the project. And so once that's done, I'm going to see on the right-hand side that I need to set up the template. So I'll set up a couple things, and then I'll run an example of what we did in part 1. So here in the setup, if I click configure, it's going to ask me for 3 things. The first is the Webflow API key, and that just basically is the unique key that links my Webflow account to Xano. Same thing with MemberStack. And then the member CMS, which is if I go to Webflow, and if I click on my CMS, I have a members CMS that basically is going to store all of my users, and I'm going to use this unique Webflow user ID to basically keep track of who's posting and who's commenting, which we'll do in this video. So if you don't know where to get these 3 keys, I cover it in part 1, so go back and reference there. But I have a notepad here open to the side, and I'll just go ahead and paste in everything that I need. Okay, so I'll go ahead and do MemberStack, and then finally I will do, there we go. All right, so we are all set and we're configured. 2 more things that I need to do. Here in the plan table, right, this plan table basically in Xano keeps track of which plans I have in MemberStack and what items are associated with them. So on the basic plan, users of the basic plan can see these 4 items, and then users of the premium plan can see the car and the yacht, okay? So I've got to enter in my plan IDs, which I basically have mapped to my memberships here. Now keep in mind, you may call your membership something different. You would just need to update the names here in the API and on the MemberStack ID field over here. So the way that we get the ID for each one of our membership plans is by going to the sign up link, just copy this. I usually just paste it in the browser. I copy it right there, and I enter in the plan ID. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing for premium. I'm going to paste this in here, and then we are good to go. Oops, there we go. Okay, so I have my 2 plans over there. So the final thing that I want to do is, I have basically an API endpoint that does a couple things. This one specifically takes the, when MemberStack basically signs up a new member, it basically lets Xano know so Xano can do all the orchestration. So I'm going to copy this link over here, MemberStack member. I'm going to go back to MemberStack. I'm going to click settings, and I'm going to go to webhooks, and then I'm going to basically add a new webhook. So I click new webhook, I click, or I paste that in, and I click new member. So again, what this is doing is it's saying that every time a new member is created in MemberStack, go ahead and call Xano using this API endpoint. And if I go into this API endpoint, let's see what it's doing. It's getting the payload from MemberStack. It's then going to Webflow, and it's creating the member in that like member CMS. We then take the Webflow ID, the unique user ID, we update MemberStack with that, or that MemberStack user with that Webflow ID, and then we add the record in the Xano table, and then we sync the membership items that they belong to. So if they signed up for Basic, they're going to get those 4 items. So that's what this endpoint is doing, okay? So final thing that we're going to need to do is we have an API endpoint called items of member. If I look in it, it basically takes a Webflow member ID, and then it gets all of the items that belong to that specific member. So I'm going to copy this URL, and what I'm going to want to do is in my Webflow template, I want to update the JavaScript files. And so the JavaScript I'm going to link below, but you should already have a flavor of this if you did step 1 or watch video 1. I'm going to click this edit in the account home basic, and this is basically for my basic membership. If I go over here, this first one, the Xano URL, is what I want to update. So you see this is my test API endpoint. I'm going to go ahead and paste in the new one. So I just went ahead and did that. Again, I'll make sure that that's correct because it didn't change. Maybe I already did it. Okay, so yeah, we're all good to go. So I'm going to save that over there. And then I want to do the same thing here for premium. So I'm going to click here in premium, and I'm going to update this URL. So there we go. And now that's updated. I'm going to click save. Okay, so now that's all done. I'll click on the sign up, and I'll just click publish. So now that this is published, let me just kind of run through what we did in part 1, and then we'll go ahead and add to that. So I'm going to go ahead and open a new window. It should take me to sign up, or I thought, well, let me just go /sign up. Okay, so let me sign up, prakash@email.com, and then I'll do password 123. Okay, I agree. So again, if I now go to Xano and if I go to my database, I don't see anything in MemberStack. If I go to members, I don't see anything in here. And then finally in Webflow, if I go to my CMS, I should see no one in here. So now when I go ahead and sign up, I'm going to confirm and pay. All right, so it's going to say, hi, welcome to Basic. If I click on Take Me to a Basic Account, I should see all of the items that belong to me. And I should see here, if I refresh the page, that Prakash has been created. I see all of those items. That's what Webflow is pulling from, these 4 items. I should see here in MemberStack, if I refresh this, that Prakash has been created with that unique Webflow member ID. And then finally in here, this member collection, if I refresh this, I should be able to see one user. Let me go back here. There it is. The one user Prakash has been created. So Xano kind of orchestrates everything together. So that's what we covered in step 1. So let's take it a step further. Remember, what we wanted to do was if we click on one of these items, we want to go to a one-up page or a single page view, right? And so let's go to Webflow. And the first thing is basically we want to update the JavaScript of both the account home or premium, basically anywhere where we have a list of items. And basically, and again, I will post the JavaScript down below, but basically what we're looking for is this. So as we basically go through this, there's a new line, one new line that we're going to add, which is this one, which basically says that there's going to be an event listener on each one of the items. And when you click on each one of these items, see, this is in the for each loop. That means that when you pull the data from the API, it's going to, for every single object that it's getting back from Xano, it's going to display a card, right? That's how it displays each one of these cards. And then what we're saying is add an event listener. And when you click on that one of those cards, you're going to take us to a page that is /item and then a query parameter, this !ID equals and then the item ID. So what this is doing is it's saying that when you click on it, go to a new page, with a query parameter $ID equals, and then insert the ID of whatever this ID is. So I haven't created the page yet, but I did add in that JavaScript. So for example, if I click on basketball, you can see here it says page not found, but it did add that /item $ID equals 2, right? So let's go ahead and do something with this. So going back to Webflow, I'm going to go ahead and create a new page. So here let me just click save. I'm going to create a new page, and remember, I want to call this item, right? That's the important thing, is this slug over here. So I want to make sure that it says item, because I want it to match what I'm doing over here. So it says item, and I'm going to go ahead and click create. So here it's a blank page. First thing I'll do is probably add a container, so things are relatively uniform. Then what I want to do is I'll probably add a div, right, for the container that the API is going to push the data into. So I'm going to click plus. I'm going to say div. So if I expand this, I can see there's a div block. And then here in the ID, you'll remember in video 1 we did cards container. I'm just going to call this item container, right? And it's not really important what you call this. You just have to remember what you call it, because that's what we're going to use in our JavaScript. So I'm going to do item container. And then what we're going to do is we're actually just going to go back here, and we're going to go to this section, and we're just going to copy this sample card. There's no need for us to reinvent the wheel here. And for those of you watching this for the first time, even though you really should watch that first video, basically we take this sample card, and in this list view, we use this as an example to repeat or we inject it into each one of these styles, right? And by the way, we've updated the JavaScript for this repeating grid, so I would definitely copy and paste it because it's a little bit more efficient, and it especially kind of fixes this cloning issue of copying the styles. But that is an aside. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to move it on to the single item page. So I'm going to rehide it again using that class. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go back to my pages. I'm going to go back to item. And then here in this container, the item container, I'm just going to go ahead and paste it. So here I see the sample card, and let me remove the hide so we can all see what it looks like. Okay, so here it is. All right, so now I want to use the JavaScript to actually load information into here. So let's go, if you click below, you're going to see the JavaScript for this, and it'll look something like this. And basically, I might as well go through the JavaScript now very quickly. The first thing that we're going to do in the first 3 lines is we're basically going to define a variable called myURL, and we're going to take the location. We're basically going to reference the location of the URL, and we're going to take that search parameter out by the word ID, right? And what we're basically saying is go to the query in the URL, strip out this item, and then what we're saying in the JavaScript is use whatever number we're getting, but if you don't get one, just go ahead and use item number 1. That's basically what this is saying. So then what we're doing is we're basically loading a URL, and this is an endpoint to basically call a single item, which we haven't created yet. We're about to do that. And then we run a function called getItem. And this is very similar to what we kind of did in the past, but instead of like getting a lot of items, we're just getting one. So high level, we're opening up an XML HTTP request. We could also do it via fetch. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but I just have written it this way. And then when it opens up, we're basically going to take the response. We're going to store it as data. And then if it's successful, right, status 200 is successful, status 400 is bad, then, and we're going to come back to this part later, then what we're going to do is we're going to look for this thing called item container, which we basically just defined, item container, get element by ID. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take that sample style, which is that card that I just copied over, and we're going to use the image source, being the banner that's coming back from the Xano's response. And then we're going to use the H3 and we're going to populate it with the name, and then the paragraph tag, and we're going to populate it with the description, and then we're going to run it. Okay, so that's basically what this is doing over here. So if I actually copy this entire, and then by the way, at the bottom, it executes it. It waits 250 milliseconds, and then it loads the page. So I'm going to basically copy this whole thing over here, and I'm going to make sure to paste it here into my JavaScript area. Now remember, I want to put in the script tags, and I just need them once, and I'll go ahead and paste them in here, okay? And then now what we want to do, remember, we need to replace this URL with get a single item. So let's go back to Xano and do that. So if I go to my API right now I have my item database table, right? So I have all my items here, but I don't have an API to basically get one of those items. An API, if is like the messenger that goes from your database and sends data to your front end. So that's basically what we want to do. We want to teach it a new command. So I'm going to click Add API Endpoint. It's a CRUD operation. That's create, read, update, delete. I'm going to reference the item table, and I'm going to do get single, right? So what I'm basically saying is create a new API endpoint that goes to the item table and fetches me one thing. So this is all done. So now if I run this, and if I say like item ID 1, for example, it should return me the puppy, right? So this is the payload that I'm getting, including the banner and the banner URL where the image is located and everything like that. And so that now you can map this to the JavaScript piece of it, right? So when it gets the response data.id actually just means this ID1 over here. So now we have this endpoint. I'm going to copy this endpoint URL. I'm going to go back to my Webflow, and I'll go ahead and paste it right here. And so instead of this item ID piece, I'm just going to remove that because we have this as my param. And remember, my param up here is where we have defined what is being passed in the URL parameter. Okay, so now this is actually all ready to go. So now when I save this, I will go ahead and publish it. And in theory, if I just refresh this page, which previously wasn't showing anything, it should work. Okay, so let me try that again. There we go. So now we are getting in, the image is being loaded, we got basketball, and then we have a Spalding basketball on a wooden floor, okay? So we have this item now being loaded, which is great. So the next thing that I want to show you how to do is how to potentially favorite this, right? So when we're favoriting it, what we're doing is we're basically taking Webflow's, we're using Webflow's webhook form submission capability. So let me show you what that means. So back in Webflow, what we're going to do is we're actually going to, let me go back to my layer stack right over here. What we're going to do is we're going to click add right over here. And what I'm going to do is I'll just go ahead and add a form block. Okay, so I'm going to click that, and you can see I have name and email address. I don't actually want the name and the email address, so I can get rid of it. The important thing is the button. So I'm going to get rid of the name, this, and this. So now all I need is the submit button. Okay. And I can actually change this name to mark as favorite. So let me go ahead and do that right now. Mark as favorite. Okay, great. So now that that's done, now what I want to do is I want to make sure the form is selected in my navigator, and I want to hit plus, and then this time I'm going to go to embed, because what we're doing actually is we're embedding a little bit of custom code to tell Webflow to pass the right parameters back to Xano, okay? And so I've already kind of have this notepad written over here, but basically this is what we're going to do. We're going to add 3 hidden fields that pass information back to Xano when this form is submitted, okay? And so if I look at this right over here, I can see the first one is I just made an ID called item ID, and this basically passes back the item of the ID I'm currently looking at, right? And then the data name is item ID. And then here, the second field is the form type, right? We have to do it this way because Webflow only allows one webhook when you submit a form, meaning when you submit a form, all forms are created equal. So we need some way to separate out like a favorite versus a comment versus anything else that we want to do. Remember, we want to add the capability not only to favorite an item, but to comment on it as well. So we need to change up what this form type is. So that's why we add this one. And then the last one is the Webflow member ID, which we're basically getting from MemberStack, right? We could also get it from Webflow, but this is where we're getting it. This should automatically load from MemberStack for you, okay? So I'm going to hit save and close, and then that should be all done. So now what I actually want to do is I want to say when I go ahead and hit this button, I want you to like go back to Xano and mark it as a favorite. So before we do that, we actually need to know what Webflow sends us when I click mark as favorite. So the way to do that is let's go ahead and click this button and let's go to our project settings over here. If I go to integrations and if I go to my webhooks, I don't have any here. So I'm going to go ahead and add a webhook, and the trigger type I want is the form submission. So when I submit a form, I want you to send a webhook. A webhook is just basically like a trigger to a certain URL. Now, I could do this to Xano, and I will soon, but I'm going to use a site called webhook.site. Because webhook.site allows me to see what I'm getting back. See, I already have this available. So let me actually, where is it? This is the URL that I want, right? So this is, I've already used this before. Let me actually just clear it. There we go. So you should see something like this. You can copy to clipboard, and this is your unique URL. Go back to Webflow over here, and then what you're going to do is paste it in there. So now that I paste in this URL, when I submit a form in Webflow, it's going to hit this webhook. So let's see what that looks like. So let's come back here. Let's publish this. And if I've done this right, I should refresh this page and I should see mark as favorite. Okay, I see mark as favorite over here, and obviously I could style it any way that I want. I'll go ahead and click mark as favorite. Thank you, your submission has been received. So if I go back to webhook.site, you can see I get this payload, right? So what am I getting back? I'm getting back in the data, I'm getting the item that it's related to. Remember, because what I did over here, just to drive this point home, is I added these 3 hidden forms. So I get the item that's associated with it, the form type, which I actually just put form type. I should have put like favorite or something, and then the Webflow member ID, right? So who is doing their favorite. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to copy this, and we're going to go into Xano and we're going to build this endpoint together. So here I'm going to just do an endpoint, right? Called let me start from scratch, and I'll just go ahead and do mark as favorite. And then I will go ahead, I'll change it to post. Anytime we're doing a webhook, we always use post. And so I'll go ahead and hit save. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to basically create a variable to store this example data in, right? A variable is basically just an empty container. So I'll create a variable, and I'll just call this Webflow payload, okay? So then here what I want to do is I can just paste in what I was getting from webhook.site, and I can import it. And what it does is it basically breaks down the key value pairs for me, so I have this to work with, okay? So now I have this variable payload. So now I have to think about, okay, well, what do I want to do with this? I probably want to now take that favorite and store it somewhere. So thinking about it just on a broader scale, if I look at my database tables, I have a database table for item, I have one for member, right, with my member, and I have one for the plan that I'm on. So I'm going to actually create a new table, and I'm going to just call it favorite. So I will say, or actually favorites, I'll call favorites. So I'll add the table, and there's 2 fields that I want in favorites. I want to know who actually did the favoriting. So I'm going to do a table reference to the member, right? That's like my user table. And then I want to know the item that they favorited. So I want to do another table reference to the item that they favorited, okay? So so now I have this here. So now, like if I entered it manually, I could say that Prakash favorited item a yacht. Even though I'm just a basic member, I could see that that is over here, okay? So now that I've done that, I'm going to go back. I've added this favorites table. I can go back to my API, and I can go back to my mark as favorite. So we're getting this payload. So what I'm first going to do, what I'm going to need to do, is I'm going to actually need to get the proper user ID using the Webflow ID. Remember, if I look at this payload, I'm only getting back the Webflow member ID. So I need to basically translate it into what ID it looks like here within Xano. So I'm going to click this button. I'm going to go to database request, and I'm going to do get record, and then I'm going to go into the member table, right? And so then it's going to ask me, okay, well, how do you want to look up this member? Well, I could look it up by ID, but I have the Webflow member ID, right? So let me save this and just show you what I mean over here. If I go to my database and I go to member, notice I'm storing the member Webflow ID. So that's what I want to look up the user by. So if I go back to mark as favorite, I can go to this record. I say, look up the member Webflow ID, and then the value, right? I want to go to this Webflow payload, which is what I'm going to be getting back from Webflow. So I can click on this thing called subpath. Subpath is our best friend, and I can just basically paste in the same response that I got from here, right? Because that's basically saying, Xano, here's an example of a response you're going to get back from Webflow. I'm going to click define. And then here what I want to do is I want to say that this ID actually matches this Webflow member ID, okay? So that's done. So now I've saved this. So now it's going to look up this specific member, right, and return it as member 1. And I'm just going to call this Xano member, okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the return, so after you do all this, return me the Xano member that you got, right? So again, recap, Webflow is going to send something like this. Xano is going to get that payload, look up the record, and return the Xano user associated with that Webflow ID. So if I run it right now, and in theory, should get back me, right? I'm the only user in the system, but it's getting back me. Okay, so now what I want to do, now that I have this member, I actually have the first thing that I need to go ahead and create my favorite, right? I have the user ID, which is right over here. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to do an add record database, add record to the favorites table, right? And now when I add this record, the created timestamp is now, that's no problem. The member ID, remember, I'm going to use that new Xano member that I'm getting back, .id, right? Because that is the ID of the user. So then for the item ID, right? I need to find the item ID in this payload. Again, remember I mentioned subpath is my best friend. So here I'm going to use this Webflow payload, subpath. I'm going to copy and paste just what I got from here, and I'm going to click define, and this time I want to select the item ID. So I'm going to click this item ID over here, okay? So I'm going to click save. So now, and it's returning as, I'm just going to say favorited item. Now I don't have to change these names, I just like to do it, okay? So now what I'm going to do is I will return this favorited item. So it gets the payload, it looks up the Xano member, and then it adds to favorite using the Xano member's ID and using the ID of the item. So I'm going to go back to my database table, my favorite, and I'm going to delete this record right here so we can see what happens. So in theory, if I run this, right, mark as favorite, it should take me as a user, and it should favorite item number 2. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So if I take this and if I run it, now I go back to my favorites table, and here I go. Prakash liked the basketball, okay? So that's all working. And now that I have the structure of everything, what I can do is I can take this right over here, Webflow payload, and I can replace it. Instead of doing it as a variable, I can have it set up to receive a webhook. So I'm going to click plus. I'm going to say, what am I doing? Utility function, and it's called get all input. So it gets all the inputs of what's being sent in the webhook. I'll use the exact same name, and I'll hit save, okay? So then here, I'm going to drag this up to the very top, and I can either hide it, but in my case, I'm going to get rid of it. Okay, so now this is all ready to go. I'm going to copy this endpoint URL. I'll go back to Webflow's settings, and I'm going to delete this one. Now, we've just used it to basically test everything out. So I'm going to delete this. I'm going to click delete over here, and then I'm going to click add webhook. I'm going to go ahead and paste that in, unformed submission, and then that's done. Okay, so now that that is done, let's go back and I'll go ahead and close this. I'll publish it one more time. And then here in this item, so if I go, for example, to item 3, right, I'm going to get this Harry Potter book. And remember, I'm still logged in as Prakash. If I mark as favorite, this should automatically send it to Xano. So if I go back to Xano now, if I go to my database, my favorites, I can see that Prakash liked this book, okay? So this is awesome. We've now set it up to where I can favorite here within Xano, okay? So let's now go back to Webflow, because one of the things that I mentioned is I wanted to not only mark as favorite, but I also wanted to comment as well. The first thing that I'll do here is I'll adjust this. So this form type, let's change this to favorite. So that means when I get the payload back, it's going to say the form type is favorite, right? So I'll save and close this, and I'm going to add another form block, right? So let me go ahead and in the container, I will click add. I'm going to do another form block here. Okay, so then this one, I will just go ahead and change this to, let's actually get rid of, I just need one of these. So I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to call this comment. We know who the user is. And then here on this one, I'm going to change it. Instead of name, I'm going to call it comment. Okay, and text is plain. It's not required. No problem. I'll press enter there. Okay, so now this is basically going to return as comment. Just wanted to make sure. So we're going to do that exact same thing. I'm going to click on the form block. I'm going to hit plus. I'm going to go down and I'm going to go to, where are you? There's the embed. And I'm going to paste that custom code again. Remember the same one I did last time. So I'm going to leave the item ID in there. And then instead of this form type being favorite, I'm just going to call this comment, right? And then this is ready to go. Okay. So, so now that that's ready, I'm going to go ahead and publish this. So back in Xano, what I want to do is I want to go back to my API endpoint. I'll just use this mark as favorite one. Now, I could do this as a separate API endpoint, but I kind of want to show you how I can conditionally do it here within Xano, because sometimes you might be making a page with using the same endpoint, but using multiple conditionals, especially because Webflow only gives you one webhook trigger on the form submission. So I'm going to show you how to do that here. So far, we can only do favorites. So I'm going to add a conditional, right? So I will do a data manipulation. I'll do a conditional. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this if statement. So I'm going to say if, and remember, I'm going to just copy this again. This is our friend, right? So this is the payload that we're getting back from Webflow when a form is submitted. So I'm going to say if this Webflow payload, and I'm going to click subpath, and I'm going to define it. And instead, now here, what I'm going to be going down to is the form type. So if this form type equals favorite, right? And you'll see what I'm doing here in a second. So if it equals favorite, you'll see it pops up here. Then I want to add this record. Whoops, I'm just jumping all over the place. Then I want you to add to favorite. Now, I could do if it equals comment, but for the sake of simplicity, because we only have two types, it's either favorite or it's comment, I'm just going to add something in the else container. So what we've done here so far, we take the form submission from Webflow, we get who is making the post. If the form type is favorite, then we're going to add a record to favorite. Otherwise, I'm going to have it add a record to comment. So let's go to the database. I'm going to add a comments table, comments, and I'm going to click save. And so here in the comments table, I'm going to do a table reference to the member, right? So who's making the comment. And then finally, I will also do a table reference to the item, right? Which item are they commenting on? And then I might as well also do the text of the comment. Okay, great. So again, the way that it would work is Prakash made a comment on the car, and he said, I like cars, okay? So that would be like an example, but we're going to use the API to do this. So let's go back to this mark as favorite or API. Where are you? Mark as favorite. So remember, if it's favorite, then you basically add a record to favorites. Otherwise, then I'm going to add a record to, where are you? Comments, okay? And I'm gonna do the same thing. So here, the member ID, I'm going to use this Xano member.id, right? For the item ID, I can do this Webflow payload. I'm gonna do the subpath. Remember, define, and I will just click on the item ID. Okay, there we go. And then the comment that we're getting back is actually one that we don't have on here. But remember, what I did was I called it something simple. Here, if I just click on this HTML embed, I just called it, or no, I didn't. Oh yeah, I did here. So the form type is comment. It's just going to come back. Oh, yes, that's right. On the text field, you know how I just called it comment? So here in this payload, there's going to be a new field called comment there, right? So anything that you basically specify in these input fields will just show up here in data. So I'm going to basically say that I can actually just close this, and I can copy this and just paste it here as comment, okay? So now it's getting comment, and you want to always make sure these are listed as variables. So I'm going to go ahead and save that, and I'll actually change the output to returned comment. Alrighty. So now that it has returned comment, I will go ahead and return that as well. So let's go ahead and try it. So now I believe I already published this. So let's go ahead and go to the item, and I will refresh this page, and I should see a comment here. And I can say, I really, really like Harry Potter. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hit save. So my form submission has been successful. So now if I go back to Xano and I go to my database and I go to comments, I can see that I left a comment on this book, and it says that I really, really like Harry Potter, okay? So we're using two form submissions, but using the conditional, we're able to separate out the favorite alongside with the comments, okay? So we have one last step. What we actually want to do is we want to list the comments that are associated with the item, right? So right now, if we look at the item itself, we've got the item, we've got the ability to favorite it, and we just had the ability to add a comment. So we want to also list the comments that are associated with the item that we're looking at. So how do we do this? So first, let's start in Webflow, right? And then what we're going to do is we're basically going to add a div to the container. So I'm going to click add, and I'm going to add a div. And so on this div, I'm going to make an ID, and I'm going to just call it comment-container, right? I can call it anything that I want as long as I also comment or specify the same name in the JavaScript. I'll add another div to that will serve as the styling for what the comment is going to look like. So I'm going to call this comment style. Okay, so that's comment style. So now that I have comment style here, I want to add two elements. I'm going to add the name of the person and what they left as a comment. So I will add two more elements. I will add a heading, and I'll make that an H4. That'll be the name of the person. And the final thing that I'll add is a paragraph, and that is going to be their comment itself. So what we've done is we've added a container called comment container. We've added a sample style called comment style, and this ID over here. We've added an H4 that's going to contain the person's name, and then the paragraph, which is going to contain their comment. So let's go to the JavaScript. So if you look at the JavaScript, we were first working in, or the first JavaScript file I showed you was basically just this get item. And the reason, like, I'm going to have it all in one file for you below, but I wanted to do one at a time so you could understand. And this get item was basically just getting, it was just getting the contents of the item that was being passed by the API, and then populating the image and the header and the description. So we've actually created a new one called get comments. And in order to utilize this, we've actually defined a new URL. So the first one was basically getting the item itself by the parameter in the URL right here, ID3. But we want to use this same parameter to pass to comments as well. So sorry, let me go back here. Notice how I have a URL with another parameter. So this one, if this gets all the items, this gets all the comments filtered by the item that we're currently looking at. So we haven't set this up in Xano, so let's go ahead and do it. Maybe you'll understand a little bit more then. So I'm going to go back to Xano right over here. I'm going to go to the API, and I can already see a get comments API endpoint that Xano created for me. Whenever you make a table in Xano, it automatically creates all the CRUD operations: create, read, update, delete. So if I went and ran this, I can see that I get all of the comments back, even if it's item 5 and item 3. But remember, I want only the ones associated with the item that I'm looking at. So I'm going to create a brand new API endpoint. So I'm going to click Add API Endpoint. I'll do a CRUD operation. I'm going to reference the comments table, and I want get a single comment, right? Or sorry, I don't want get single. I want lots of comments, but I want to filter it by that item ID, which I'll show you in a second. So there we go. And I'm going to just say comment by item. Okay, that's what I want to call it. And I'm going to click Save. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to add an input, because we're taking an input from the user. Actually, we're taking an input from this query parameter over here, right? So I'm going to say add. I'm going to say an integer, because that's what type of input it is. And I'm just going to call this the item ID, right? Because that's what I'm getting back from from the JavaScript, or what the JavaScript is sending me back. So right now we're getting all comments, but I actually want to do a custom query on this get all comments. So I'm going to hit this edit. I'm going to add a conditional, and I want to make sure that the input, right, that item ID that is being fed to this API endpoint equals, right, in the database, the item ID of the comments, right? So I'm going to save this, and let me show you what I mean in case you're lost. In comments, you'll notice that there is an item ID field. I'm basically saying I want all of the comments as long as it matches this specific item ID. Okay, so you can see this item ID for Harry Potter is number 3. You can see it over here as well. So if I run that API endpoint, I should only be getting back the Harry Potter comment. So comment by item, I do this. I want to make sure that this lines up. So now when I run this, right, and if I hit number 3, I should only get back my Harry Potter comment. There we go. Okay. So I'm getting that back, and so this is all ready to go. So I now take this URL and I make sure that it is updated over here, which I think it is, but let's just check. You're definitely going to want to make sure, because your URL will look a little bit different. See, I'm glad I did that. It's comment by item plus my param. Okay. So let's see. I think that's okay. And actually what I can do, this comment by item, I can put a slash at the end of it, and I can also go to Xano, and I can just do edit, and I'll explain to you what I'm doing in a second, slash item ID. Okay, so the reason I've set it up this way is because just like we did this item slash item ID, this basically tells Xano to use whatever number they put in the query parameter as this input. So similarly, what I did here with this comment by item, I specified this item ID as the query parameter. So now when I run this, right, this number 3, it'll still work, but the way that I've set it up here is in the JavaScript, I can use just the URL to load in the parameter, okay? So this should all work just fine now. So now I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to go back into Webflow, and I'm going to go well, actually what I want to do, I want to hide this because I don't want to show my example comment card. So I'm going to go hide. There we go. I'm going to click here. I'm going to go to item, which is right over here. I'll scroll down, and I'll just paste it. Oh, I want to put it between the script tag. There we are. So now that I've done that, and I click Save, and I publish it, in theory, when I refresh the page, I should see Harry Potter, and I should see a single comment by me on Harry Potter. Okay, I really, really like Harry Potter, but I'm not seeing my name. Let's see why. So in the JavaScript, if I read the JavaScript, I can see that's an H4. Did I do that over here? See, like sometimes we have to debug it like this. So here, if I go back to this, yeah, so this is H4. Yeah, that's totally fine. So let's make sure in Xano. Oh, I know why. Okay, so this is actually a really important point. Notice how here we basically have the comment, but we don't have the person's name. That's because in Xano, we're only getting their name referenced by the ID. So we actually need to turn this ID into the person's full name. So the way we actually do that is Xano has this thing called add-ons. It's similar to GraphQL if you've ever used that before. And it basically uses that to enrich the data of a single API endpoint. So I'm going to go to Output. I'm going to click Add-on. And it says, well, what do you want to add on to this data? Well, I want to add on the member, right? And I'm just going to do a single item. I don't need a list of users. There's only one user that's associated with a comment. So I'm going to click Next, and I'll go ahead and click Create. And then here, I could return it as member, but I'm going to delete it. So it basically just returns as self, and you'll see what I mean in a second. So when I run this now again, I can see that not only am I getting my comment, but I'm getting the member name. So now this should populate correctly because the member name is already there. So now let's see if I run this again. If I refresh it, I should see Prakash, and I should see I really, really like Harry Potter. And I can say, I almost forgot, please read all the books. And if I hit submit, it's going to do that. And then I refresh this again, and then I can see yet another comment for Harry Potter. So I know this was a long one, but we've done a lot of things here. We've gone from a list view. We've clicked on that single item from that list view, and then we see the item here. We've been able to mark it as favorite. We've been able to add a comment, and we've been able to now list all the comments. There is so much more that you can do. Obviously, you have to understand JavaScript a little bit, but in the JavaScript file, I've genuinely tried to comment as much as possible to give you a sense of what's going on. And yeah, I hope that this is helpful, and we'll probably be doing more videos like this. But this takes it the next step further, and I appreciate you if you've made it this far for tuning in. Please like and subscribe if it's been helpful. Thank you so much.